Hi there, I'm Anya. I'm a 3D environment and 2D concept artist. I work as a freelancer, and before that I worked at Creative Assembly. And at the moment I'm working at Rare on a game called Everwild. I did a painting for ImagineFX, which you, I assume, have looked at, and I recorded my process, and I thought I would share it with you and just talk through what's going on here on your screen, and what my thoughts and feelings were as I went along as well. So, got about an hour to talk through this. And I suppose I'll begin with what you're looking at right now, which is me sketching. But what I am sketching over is a 3D render, which I have made. So it's some really basic 3D models, which I made inside 3ds Max. A free alternative to that would be Blender. Blender is free to use. I haven't used it myself, but I've heard very good things. And the program that I've actually rendered it in, so where I've added the lighting, and I've taken the screenshot, and I've added in the white material that is on all of these objects, is Unreal Engine 4, which is also free. My process for when I paint involves using a 3D base like this. It just gives me something really solid to work from. I don't need to worry so much about the perspective and things like that. So this painting started with a very basic sketch with no perspective or anything like that, just an idea. I worked from a lot of reference images, things that inspired me. And then once I decided what kind of direction I wanted to go in, I made a load of 3D models, really basic 3D models, put them in Unreal Engine, put a light in there, and started painting over it just like this in Photoshop. It works really well. It means I don't need to worry so much about getting the lighting, and as I said, perspective right, because it's kind of already done for me. There's a lot of tweaking that I do, and a whole lot more that you could do. But it just gives me something that I can really go wild on and just put all my ideas down as quickly as possible and have fun with it. And it means I can be more creative. So here you can see that I'm working over this 3D block out just with a hard round brush with transparency on. Areas that have stairs I've just modelled as like a flat ramp, so I actually sketch in the stairs myself by hand. Things like bricks, decoration on walls, archways, is all stuff that I add in myself. It's more the difficult stuff to get right with perspective, such as the boat, the table and chairs, and the overall shapes, the archways of the bridge and so on. They're the things that I'm putting in 3D to work with. You can see I'm checking occasionally what it looks like without the 3D model underneath. But this 3D base that I've got here is something that I will continue to use for the duration of the entire painting. Now this video is about an hour long, just over an hour. The duration of this painting from start to finish, from the stage that this video begins, was about 9 hours. And that's after I've made the 3D model and the 3D block out. Things such as foliage and vines, lily pads, things like that. I tend to add in just by hand, not so much using 3D models, but you can see that I've got a few leaves in there, especially ones that are closer to the camera, that I've taken the time to 3D model just so I've got something to work with, perspective-wise, shape-wise. just makes stuff a little bit more believable. And I think that's the big thing here, is the 3D model is definitely not something you have to work with, but it does help you get those more believable shadows. You can see here that I'm actually taking the time to paint in my own lighting and shadows. So once I've got that 3D block out on my sketch, I start adding in my own values, additional values, things that I think might improve the painting. So here I'm working in some scattered lighting, a darker shadow for the archway through the tunnel, darkening the bottom of the water. But you can see I quite quickly actually test stuff and then often will undo it. You've got to not be afraid to test things when I'm painting like this. So the aim of this painting is to just create an overall illustration that gives a feel for an environment. It's not necessarily a finalized image. So the final painting still has some areas that aren't left fully rendered out. You can see here I'm starting to think about colour as well. So I've just made another layer, and I just take my hard round brush that has transparency on it, and I just play around with colours. You can see in the colour picker in the top right of the screen, I have it set to hue, saturation, brightness, and that's so that I can very carefully control my colours by shifting the hue, the colour, how saturated it is, whether it's got more grey or white or more pigment, and how bright it is, whether it's light or dark. And I just paint over with some colours just to test it out. You can see here I'm trying adding atmospheric perspective, which is what that blue hue is. Because it's so far away, there would be some sort of atmospheric perspective, and it pushes back what is through that archway as well, so it actually reduces the contrast back there. And because that's in the background of the image, having something that has less contrast actually works quite well, because you want the stuff in the foreground, the boat and the table and the chairs, to be the focus of the image, and that will be where the highest contrast is, where the areas of light and dark will be closest together. The colours at this stage are quite simple and basic. To spruce it up a bit, I actually make another layer underneath the initial colour layer that I made. Here I actually accidentally start working on my value layer, which is why you can see the layer is called value edits in the layers palette. But that should be a separate layer, and I just work over the values and work under my first colour layer. And I just start adding sort of slightly more crazy colours and just have a bit more fun with it, because you've got your initial basic colours at the top, the greens of the grass and the browns and greys of the stone. So if I go underneath and start adding brighter oranges and more interesting colours, the colour layer on top and the new colour layer underneath will start to mix in interesting ways. The way I work is all about trying to get interesting colour combinations. I'm also careful to make sure I get interesting colour variation in surfaces, so archways and sort of trims of stone, like around the edge of the grass, I work in with a different colour to the main area of the stone colour. Now I'm starting to reintroduce my values. So when I was adding my colour, I was working over my value edits, and I was losing the values because I was just painting over it with colour. Now I bring my value layer back to the top, and I overlay it, and then I start playing around with colour gradients as well. And this just reunifies all the colours. can see I've got 2 gradient layers here, and that's because I'm overlaying 2 different layer modes. So the top one is luminosity, and I think the one underneath is linear light, although I can't quite remember. But you can layer as many different effects as you want to get the color that you like. It's all very rough and basic at the moment, and I'm just testing stuff out. So I'm trying to make sure the area in the background is light, but it doesn't fight with the area in the foreground, which is the focal point. So at this stage, I actually start to render stuff. The hard part is definitely the beginning of the painting, trying to get the colors down, trying to get the values right. But if you get that initial stage right, generally you can get the painting to work once you go into rendering it. But it can be quite difficult to keep those values and colors and not stray too far from it. And you'll see my final painting it's relatively similar to what I've got here, but it does change a little because I make some changes in my design decisions. The starting stage of a painting for me is always the part where, when I start rendering at least, it's the part where I'm a little bit confused about how I'm going to go forth with the painting. So I'll be testing a lot of different ways of working to start with. But the general way that I paint is I use the lasso tool, the polygon lasso tool. And I just select areas, and I take a brush, and I just fill that area with colour. And I switch between a brush with colour dynamics and hue jitter turned on, which is why you can see that some of the initial blocks of colour I lay down have a kind of banding of colour across them. And then sometimes I use a brush which just has either transparency on or transparency off, but I always use just a round brush. I think it's always good to learn how to paint with a round brush, like a hard round brush. And then down the line you can start introducing other brushes. But I like to stick with just my hard round brush. So the hue jitter brush that I'm using, it has very little done to it in terms of settings. It's literally just color dynamics is on, hue jitter is on and turned up a little bit. There's a lot of settings in there which you can play with. So I definitely recommend opening up a brush and playing around with the color dynamic settings. It's very nice for just giving you colors that you wouldn't have thought to use and color combinations that you wouldn't have considered. When I paint, I do a lot of color picking from my own painting, especially once I've got the initial colors down. And when you use hue jitter in your brush, you can pick colors that have just very subtle variation, and it gives the suggestion of there being texture on a surface. Whereas if you use just a flat color, the surface will look flat. So at this stage, I had an initial moment where I was working with the large leaves, and I was just testing out some rendering workflows and painting stuff. And then I decided to move on and start working in more blocks of color again. So you can see I'm selecting areas and then painting in color. And I'm always checking my 3D layer underneath and just checking where the shadows are. Because if you work within the constraints of your 3D layer, the shadows will make sense. And the painting will feel more sensical and realistic, even though I'm not working in a realistic style. I constantly paint and repaint colors to test, Maybe I'll add more blue, maybe I'll add more orange. And this can take a little while to settle on what colours I'm actually using. I'm just constantly testing things until I find something that feels right. Here I am just checking my 3D render, picking an area in the sunlight and painting it in with white. And again, just trying to simplify my values down to areas in the sun and areas in shadow. Here I am again, trying to simplify down the foliage. Picking out the areas in the light and areas in shadow. The initial stage of a painting like this is always just making sure I get the shadows and the light in. With something like this, it can look tedious to be picking all the shadow areas and so on, but for me it works well because it means that I can get the areas color picked and then just have fun with the colors. If I hold, once I've got an area selected like this, if I press Ctrl H, it keeps the selection, but it takes away the marching ants edge from the selection, and it means I can just take a big brush and just paint in an area, see how it looks, and not have that marching ants edge distracting me from what I'm looking at. So I start painting in the leaves again. This area at the top at the end of the painting I actually just completely rework because I never quite like it, and you can see me kind of thinking about it and redoing it. So at this stage I was quite happy with the painting. I was probably a couple of hours in to the painting, you know, with the sketch included and everything. And I liked how it felt, the colours and the lighting. But something just felt a little bit off. And I come to realise later on that that comes from the background. The sort of building on the left-hand side in the background was just a bit too contrasty. So you'll see that I actually pushed that back and really reduced the contrast. But before that, I just take the time to fill in the larger areas of colour. Get the lily pads in, fill in some shadow areas on some rocks. I'm just trying to do big broad strokes, so rather than getting bogged down with the foliage like I was at the beginning, I just start trying to get in larger areas of colour. Any detail that I do add is just kind of quick and sketchy to start with, because I'll come back in at the end and make a proper rendering pass using a nice clean brush. So stuff here is just me kind of blobbing in colour, seeing how it'll look in the overall painting from a distance. You can see that I generally, when I'm painting, stay quite zoomed out, because I'm working on an overall image. I'm not trying to focus on one little part. When I'm painting the water, as you can see here, I work as if the water does not have a surface. I actually just paint what I imagine would be under the water if it was crystal clear. And I just add this green colour to everything, so I work everything in shades of green and blue-green. And I don't try to add any reflections or anything yet. And when you work in this way with water, it gives the water a really lush feel. Crystal clear water, who doesn't want to sit with their feet in that? Again, I'm not trying to get too bogged down in painting details, but I am trying to get the general light and shadow of larger objects, like this boat, which is pretty much slap bang in the middle of the painting. I want to make sure that my highlights and shadows match my 3D render, again, because it makes it believable. I actually moved this boat from its original position in my 3D render, as in I took my 3D render and cut the image and actually moved the boat down a little bit. It's okay, but it didn't really make sense. The perspective didn't feel quite right. The shadow that I then kind of made up didn't quite work either. So actually right at the end of the painting, I changed it back to be in the position that it should have been all along. So that'll teach me to try and edit my 3D renders after the fact. So I'm just using blocks of color with subtle variation to give the suggestion of detail rather than carefully painting in every single leaf and every single bit of negative space. So here I am just filling in a huge area of shadow. As I say, the broad strokes thing really is important. Overall, the image really is very simple. And I don't want to overcomplicate it. So sometimes it's good to just go in, take a look at the 3D model, see where the shadows are, select the whole area of shadow using Polygon Lasso tool, and just paint the whole thing with a dark color. And just freshen it up a bit, because you can get a little bit bogged down in details. I experiment with the idea of making the boat have a more interesting shape, but I decide it's distracting, so I make it go back to how it was before. I want the fronts of the boats in the foreground to have a little bit of detail on, but not be distracting. So I keep it all quite dark coloured, as if it's in shadow. I make up some lily pads. Now these are all in shadow, so the colour that I use is very cool. It's not super dark because I still want it to stand out from the water underneath it, but it's obviously not as bright as the ones in the foreground. Usually when I'm working with a sketch that I've done, I start out by working underneath my sketch. So my sketch is at the very, very top of my layer stack, and I will usually lock that layer so I don't accidentally start working on it, because I think we've all accidentally worked on the wrong layer at some point and had to delete things that we don't want to delete. After a point though, and you can see here, I'm actually working over the sketch. And eventually I'll reach a point where I actually turn the sketch off entirely. But for now I keep it on for reference, just like my 3D layer. And once I've worked over it a certain amount, I'll just bring the sketch back up to the top of the stack, turn it off, and then I can turn it on for reference as I paint later on. But once a lot of my basic shapes are in, I don't really need the sketch because it's very, very basic. I never go into too much detail. I tend to keep my brush size actually quite large when I'm sketching. I stay zoomed out as much as I can, and I just work the basic shapes in. The edges of archways, the edges of what would be foliage, maybe some patterning on walls. I think the smallest detail I put in here was a mug on the table. Water lilies are one of my favourite things to add in because it breaks up the surface of the water. So I always tend to put a good amount of love into those. I don't tend to wet my water in blue. I have aspects of blue, but mostly it's green. It just feels a bit more lush. I avoid having areas of whites on my water because that gives the effect of it being cloudy or dirty. I might add small white highlights at the end, but I try and keep the colours as pure as possible so the water feels purer. So you can see here I'm selecting an area for where the sunlight would be hitting this building. So it's worth reminding you this is a bit that I made up. This doesn't actually exist particularly in my 3D blockout. So I'm taking a bit of a risk adding this in. It kind of looks okay, but you can see here it's really distracting from the foreground because it's the exact same value as my foreground area. It's very white. And with these areas in the shadow that I'm painting now, in these shades of pink and purple, it's very contrasty. That as a standalone painting would be fine, like that area through the archway. But as a background area, it doesn't quite work because it's so contrasty, it's distracting. So you can see me starting to think, okay, maybe I should reduce down the amount of light here. Maybe I should darken down the sunny areas so that it's less contrasty. But that's not really working either. Start trying to up the contrast in the foreground because it still doesn't feel quite right. So I add lots of areas of darkness. I think maybe it's the boat. Maybe the boat doesn't feel quite right and I need to make that more contrasty, make it feel like it's sat in shadow or sunlight. And then I start to think, okay, maybe I should just try and chill stuff down in the background. Still keep that sunlight feel, but just try and chill it down a little bit. So that's the first attempt I make at that, and I come back to it multiple times, and we get there eventually. It's all about trial and error, and it takes time and practice. But the 3D blockout hopefully keeps at least some of the stress out of it. Again, it's getting a little bit contrasty. That dark red edge around the archways is really drawing my attention. But I just want to add in some foliage, so I play around with the shadow colour and the area in the sun. You can see I never use just a darker hue for the shadow. If something's in shadow, I will usually make it a little bit cooler, so I've got this more bluey green in the shadow here. I usually add blue into a colour if it's in the shadow. And the reason for that is if something's in an outdoor space and it's a sunny day, like it is in this painting, the sky is going to be quite blue. And if the sky is blue, shadows are going to have a bluish hue. It's kind of like bounce light, but from the entire sky. Little aspects like the stairs on the staircase, just adding in little details like that just gives it a sense of scale. So you can see now, like, that's the size of a step, and we all know how big a step is. We all have stairs and walk upstairs. So we know now roughly what the scale is in relation to a human being. I felt like the painting was a little bit pink at this stage, so I started trying to remove some aspects of the pink and instead replace it with more like red or salmon-y colours. And the shadowed areas, which are also quite pink, I start trying to make a bit more bluish. Like I was saying, if it's a really bright, sunny day and the sky is blue, shadows will be bluish. And especially with that water. Water will usually create a slightly bluish glow underneath stuff. For instance, the underside of these archways, these big archways, if they were smaller and closer to the water, you'd get a kind of bluish or greenish hue being reflected up onto the water from the sky. So it can be interesting to add in blue bounce light underneath archways or on the underside of plants near water. Any way to get interesting colours into your shadows that would otherwise just be quite dark can really brighten up and bring life into a painting. If something's near grass and it's really bright, it's going to get a greenish colour in the shadows because the green of the grass will be bouncing up into the shadows. That's not to say you can't bend or break the rules if you need to. So I've got a lot of the basic colours in now. So I just start another pass of adding more detail, more leaves, more colours. Like I said, at this point I'll usually be colour picking quite a lot from the painting rather than going up to my colour picker to pick new colours. I add little surface edge highlights and just give the suggestion of light catching an object and it being 3D. Edge highlights to the stairs. Just tidying up some of the artifacts from where I've used the magic wand tool to select colours. Then I just want to add in some nice highlights, as if the sun's catching the edges of stairs. So I'm just tidying up everything a step at a time. Usually when I'm tidying things like this, I use my hard round opaque brush. Here I'm just trying to add some of that bluish bounce light I was talking about from the water. So the water's reflecting a blue light up onto the rock face, and it just gives it a kind of surrealish glow. And again, adding it into the top of that archway. The water's reflecting that bluish light up. And then I just go into my basic shapes that I've painted in, and I'll start using the lasso tool to just select the shapes of leaves and start painting in leaves, things like that. So it starts off with like a basic kind of almost blobby shape for an item such as a vine or for ivy, and then I'll come in with smaller shapes and paint it in a subtly different colour to give the suggestion of leaves, and I'll do that multiple times so that you get multiple layers of different coloured leaves. Just adding little speckles of light as if light is reaching through plants and just catching the water. And then just adding some little edge highlights. Like I said, edge highlights are a nice way of suggesting that something has 3D shape. No matter how simple an object is, it will always catch light along that 90-degree corner. So here I am finally trying to fix whatever's been bugging me about this background area. I just take a colour, layer it over that area, and then just test out loads of different layer modes. And you can see me just going through loads of different layer modes. Some bits feel right, some places don't feel right. I choose to layer a linear light mode with a sort of corally colour over the whole image. And then I've applied a layer mask, and I'm just painting out areas where I want to retain the initial colour. So all the greenish colour in the foreground, I definitely want to keep the greenish colour, so I paint out this orangey colour. The orangey yellowy colour also gives the sense of it maybe being evening, coming up to evening, late afternoon. And it feels very illuminated. I highly recommend testing out layer modes. Layer modes such as difference, exclusion, linear light, pin light, overlay. If you just slap a colour on a layer and put it on these layer modes and just see what happens. Put it on a layer mode and then open a hue saturation adjustment and just change the colour and see what happens. You can get some really interesting effects, especially if your layer that you're using isn't just a flat colour and it has colour variation in it. That's a big way that I get colours in my paintings. It's just happy accidents. So you can see what it looked like before and after. So the paint before was very bluish. Now it's a bit more bright and happy feeling. And again, always testing it against my 3D layer. You can actually see I briefly set my 3D layer to a multiply layer and just multiplied it over just to see how that looked, to make sure the shadows are all working together as originally anticipated. Here I'm just recorrecting my values a little bit. So areas in the foreground should be darker. So I'm just darkening down the foreground areas a little bit. Nothing too crazy, but it just makes the painting more readable again. Do it really simply with my polygon lasso tool, and I can tidy that up later when I do my final cleanup and render pass. Just reintroducing some elements of blue into my shadows, and that again is by just painting out my new linear light layer, painting out in the mask. Just doing loads of different tests. It's about constantly testing stuff and trying things out. Using hue saturation adjustments just to get big, passing, sweeping changes. It can at least give you a new perspective on what you're looking at. So that lightening of the area in the background means that we lose some of those darker shadows. And that's a good thing in this case, because I don't want that to be the focal point of this painting. I want it to feel pushed back, like there's some sort of mist between me and that building. You can see that my painting on a semi-regular basis goes black and white, and that's me checking the values. It's much easier to see what values are doing when a painting is in black and white. Things that are very light yellow, for instance, can appear to be a much brighter value than they are if you make it grayscale. And the way that I make it grayscale is I use Control Y as my shortcut. And I've set up that shortcut in advance. You can see here I'm testing out adding some foreground foliage. Again, just to make it feel like you're looking into the painting from maybe inside a cave or underneath a canopy of some trees in the jungle. I never switch away from using my round brushes. Sometimes I use a soft edged brush, but generally I use a hard round brush. Just keep checking what I'm doing, changing my mind. It's okay to change your mind. Delete things, add things. this little bit of cliff that I'm adding here on the right hand side just acts to frame the painting a little bit. That's what this foreground dark foliage tends to be. It's like a frame so that it closes in the painting nicely and it doesn't feel like anything is falling out of the frame of the painting. Especially if you have very light areas close to the edge. It's good to just have a little bit of a frame. These stalks for the lily pad that I'm adding, they're nice, but the main reason I add them is to give a sense of depth to the water, because you don't actually know how deep the water is just from looking at it, but adding in these lily stalks gives the sense that you can see where the water ends at the top, where the actual flowers and leaves are, and you can see where the bottom of the water is, where those stalks converge into the ground. So here I start adding in little colour details such as flowers, so they just break up the areas of green, because that water is just various shades of green and blue, so I'm throwing some pink in there just to break it up a little bit. The flowers could be yellow, they could be white, as long as they break up that green. So here I'm working with my opaque hard round brush. And what I do is when I'm working with this brush, I don't just paint freehand a lot of the time. I work by holding down Shift, and I just tap with my stylus, and I create an almost dot to dot of lines. And that means I get really clean lines because my hand isn't shaking and wobbling around. And it gives quite a graphical feel. So I don't have it so much now, but you can see here on this leaf that that is the method I'm using to fill in all of this. And I just do little areas of colour, little areas of desaturation, and then layered in there maybe an area of like really saturated colour. And it just gives that variation and that graphic feel. Maybe on the edge of a lily pad, I might go in with a really saturated green and just add a little bit of an edge in a really, really saturated green. It just gives that nice surface variation. So I'm just adding a little bit of orange here and there. A little bit of more saturated green and green variants. I just constantly take my hue slider and I just shift it a little bit left and right of where I'm working to get a little bit of colour variation. This point in the painting it's sort of the last third of the painting. I'm pretty happy with what I have, and now it's pretty much just tidying mode. So I usually spend the first third of a painting getting ideas down, blocking out colours and lighting, and testing stuff. The middle half is kind of working over that test bed that I made and Still working quite roughly, but painting more colours down, working out where flowers are going to go, adding in like very rough kind of lasso tooled areas of colour and colour variation. The final step, the final third, is usually this more, I hesitate to call it rendering because it's not really rendering because it's still very loose, but it's more carefully rendered out. You can see I'm picking areas of colour, choosing what colour I'm going to use, and just laying it down fully opaque. But I'm still leaving these rough areas of hue jitter brush. You can see it especially under the archway in this view. And I've used it pretty much everywhere really, and the combination of these really clean areas and then the more brushy kind of hue jittery thing, for me, I like, and so I will just leave some of that hue jitter showing through in places. At this stage, you might not have noticed, but I've actually decided to move the boat back to where it was, as I said in my original render, so the boat has actually moved up a little bit. And I'm redoing the shadow to match perfectly my 3D block out that I made, which is what I'm doing here. I'm just kind of tidying up after moving the boat, because I just sort of selected it with the lasso tool and moved it. Here I am referring to my 3D render just to get it really nice and tidy. And you can see already the boat just feels a little bit better. And I decide to just really clean up what I've done so far. So there's some areas in shadow here that really, according to my 3D render, should be in light. So I decided to just bring that sunlight in. Add in some areas of colour variation so it's not all just one flat green. You can see at the edges of where light and shadow meet, I'll often add just like a little line of a subtly different colour or a little more saturated area. And I just tidy everything up. And it just feels better, so I'm glad that I made the decision to overhaul this part of the painting. It was a bit annoying to do, but it was worth it. The shadow that I had made up initially just didn't really make sense, because I'd kind of forgotten the direction of the light. The light is coming from kind of over your left shoulder as you look at this painting, like high up in the sky, over your left shoulder. So you can see where the boat shadow is. It's kind of not super visible, and I wanted to make the shadow clearer, but it didn't work very well. It works better with it where it's how it should have been in the first place. And I just decided as well, this area in the distance, I want to tidy it up, clean it up. So I just carry on with my holding shift and tapping to fill areas and get some nice colour variation as well. Just adding in little areas of edge highlight, just to get some colour variation. I tried to tidy up these leaves. They're a little bit messy, and I probably should have just redone them in the end, but there's only so much time I can spend on some leaves, so I decided to leave them as they are. Add in the suggestion of stonework and detail. So I'm not going in and rendering every brick. I just paint in the edges. It's very simplified. Adding in some colour variation to the edges of the shadows. And again, just try and tidy stuff up a little bit. This cliff that I'm currently painting out, I didn't quite like how it was encroaching on the focal point, so I just paint it back a little bit, push it to the side, and then just simplify it down again. I remove the textural nature of the hue jitter, and I just have flat colour on there so it's not attracting any attention. Check values. Just another suggestion of detail, little highlights and stuff. I'm starting to feel pretty good about how this is going. As I've said, it's still very rough. This isn't intended to be a full-on illustration, final painting. It just gets the idea of the area, the feel that I want. But I still need to do some tidying up. This cliff area, like I said, I wasn't super happy with it. I kept reworking it and reworking it. I didn't like how the values felt, so I wanted to tidy those up. If I went too dark, it felt like it was drawing too much attention. And sometimes when things just still don't quite feel right, it's good to just take a step back, look back at the 3D, and just kind of realign yourself with what the original plan was. Or to go and paint some leaves. That also is nice. Little suggestions of detail. So I stepped away for a bit and then I came back and I still didn't like it. So I just go to my 3D model and I'm like, right, okay, select the areas that are in the sun. Go back to my painting and just paint that in. Paint the areas that are in shadow. The bits that I've missed for some reason, I just make sure I've got those in shadow. And you can see already that it's feeling a lot better. See here, I just decided to select that and just paint it all one colour. I wasn't liking where it was going, it needed redoing. So I just paint it all one colour, forget about what I've done, and start again. Much better. Part of the reason it was drawing too much attention was because it was so noisy. making that decision to just clear that area and start fresh was the right one, because now it is cleaner, which means it's not attracting attention. And now I can go back in and actually start adding in the gradients and the shadows like I have been for the rest of the painting. At this stage, you can see that I've made another sketch off camera. This is very, very quick, just to say, okay, look at my painting at this point, what else can I add? And I just sketch over with my sketchy brush. Maybe there could be some leaves here, maybe there could be a little hole in the stone with an archway in it there, maybe here there could be some vines growing or some moss. Maybe there could be a person sat here, a coffee cup there, a potted plant. And it's just the final touches that I think would help sell the painting. I just really quickly sketch them in and then start rendering them like this. This addition of hanging vines or whatever from the bridge is another way of pushing back that background building. Because they're so dark, they really stand forwards from the area in the sun behind. So I make sure that anything new that I paint into that background area is quite light, not too saturated, it doesn't stand out too much, it just blends in with that background. Painting some sort of damaged statue or something that existed here. Use the hue jitter brush to give that sense of texture. Just start working in those little details. I don't go crazy hyper rendered or anything, this is as high detail as I go. But the fact that the objects are there, especially when you're viewing the painting from a zoomed out point, it just gives that suggestion of detail. Little human level things like cups, books, pots. The chair and table especially tells you exactly how big something is, because we all know how big a table and chair is. The boat doesn't help so much because you get so many different sized boats that you could never possibly know. But the chair and table really gives a scale to the matter, and you can see as well that I've sketched in a person, and well, that's it really. You know how big a human is, so you know how big the world is. I don't usually add characters to my paintings, but I thought why not for this one. There's little blue edge highlights, as if the water was catching the light and reflecting off of those edges. No, I'm not a character artist, so you'll have to excuse the probably terrible anatomy and proportions that I've got going on here, but I tried, and that's the main thing. I think putting a character in the environment as well just sells it as a place that you could be, especially if this person's reading a book. They're sat there, they're reading a book, and you could imagine yourself in this environment and place yourself there, rather than having just an empty world. I just want to reiterate that my shadows are never just a darker version of a colour, or very rarely at least. It will always be, if something's lighter, I'll warm it up. Add yellow, hue shift it more towards orange. And if something's in shadow, I'll often hue shift it more blue or green. There's no harm in just lasso tool selecting an area, painting it with a shadow colour, and then taking a transparent brush and just layering over blue, green, maybe a bit of yellow, just to almost like painting it for real. You just layer colours on top of each other until you get something that's a mixture of whatever you've layered down. I often do that just to feel colours out. This person is now me, because I have blue hair. And this is where I want to live, so I've put myself in it. And what I would do to put my toe in some nice cold water right now. Give myself some derpy eyes, and then change my mind because it's too weird. So this is a painting at a pretty much finished stage as far as my kind of sketchy style goes. So now I'm kind of I'm coming in and being like, it would be nice if. These aren't essential things, but the things I like to add to paintings. And those things usually involve fish, if there is water in the painting, and light sparkles, some sort of dust motes catching the light. God rays are another good one that I like to add. More flowers, more plants. Just nice. It would be nice if things. And the fish, again, add a nice scale to the water. They kind of give a bit of life to it. I make sure that I consider if they're catching the light. They'd be darker in the shadowed areas and lighter in the light areas. I've taken the layer and duplicated it and then painted it in the colour of the shadows so that some of the fish that are in the sunlight are actually casting a shadow on the bottom of the water. little things like water ripples to give the sense that there is actually a surface to the top of the water. I went a little bit overkill with the water, so I actually bring it back down, but especially in that area through the archway, you want it to look like it's in the distance and the water's just catching off of the ripples of the water. So I've added these light sparkles. And again over here, but I do reduce it down. And then lastly, I start to think about adding some little light sparkles. So I just add little specks. And that's the final touch on my painting. So I'm going to say thank you for sticking it out for this whole hour and watching my painting. I hope it was useful. Feel free to reach out to me if you would like. It's been nice telling you about my painting. And good luck with your own.